Hey! I'm too far in the cockpit. Please, a quick fire!
The audio that you guys just listened to is clearly very disturbing, and it becomes even more disturbing once you realize that these were the final moments of the 3 astronauts on board the first crewed Apollo mission, Apollo 1. I'm sure that many of you guys have at least heard of the Apollo space missions. These were back in the 1960s, and they played a very pivotal role in American history. Namely, they happened during the Cold War, which first started 2 years after World War II and lasted all the way until 1991, and it was basically the Soviet Union versus the United States, capitalism versus communism. So smack dab in the middle of the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union found themselves in a battle to space. Specifically, they wanted to be the first country to send a man to space and, going the extra mile, be the first country to put a man on the moon. In 1961, the Soviet Union actually succeeded on being the first country to send a man to space, a man by the name of Yuri, and because of this, the US decided they needed to ramp up their efforts, and they started the Apollo program. The same exact year that the Soviets sent Yuri into space is when the US pulled the trigger on this and made their most famous space program, the Apollo series. It cost roughly $25.4 billion to create it, which is over $100 billion in today's dollars, had approximately 400,000 people working on it, not to mention dozens of astronauts willing to put their lives on the line and risk getting this mission done. Now, for the most part, these missions would go off without a hitch over the course of its creation, but the first manned mission, Apollo 1, was very different. For some backstory, Apollo 1 was set to launch on February 21st of 1967, and again, this was the first manned mission of the Apollo series with the end goal of putting a man on the moon. The crew consisted of 3 members: the command pilot, Gus Grissom, the senior pilot, Edward H. White II, and pilot Roger B. Chaffee. For Gus, the most experienced pilot here, this would have been his 3rd spaceflight, for Edward his 2nd, and for Roger his 1st, but all 3 of these guys had one thing in common. This would be their last spaceflight, and I don't mean that in a positive way. On January 27, 1967, just 2 weeks before the planned launch, the crew of the Apollo 1 entered the command module for a routine pre-flight check. What should have been an uneventful day turned into one of NASA's darkest moments. During this test, the astronauts, Gus, Edward, and Roger, jumped into the command module, and for those of you that don't know, this is where the astronauts are seated during the flight, which contained a very oxygen-rich atmosphere. Now, you might be tempted to think that this is a good thing when it comes to spaceflight, but for those of you that know anything about oxygen, it's a highly flammable gas, and this, clearly by now, you could probably see where this is going, is not going to be a good thing for them. And yes, out of the 400,000 people working on this project, there were quite a few people who cautioned against having such an oxygen-rich atmosphere, bringing up the exact same issues that I just told you guys. But the people that were running this project still decided that this was going to be the best choice, and it ended up turning into a disaster. Because during the test, there was a spark, probably from faulty wiring, that ended up starting a fire and creating an open flame. It was at this point that the crew truly noticed what was happening, but it was too late. They were already dead, and they knew it. Despite their efforts to get out, and despite calling out and creating the audio that you guys heard at the beginning of this video, nobody was able to rescue them, and this was for one specific reason. Let's think about this for a second. Let's say you're an employee, and you're working somewhat close to the command module when this very disturbing audio comes through. Most people's first inclination would be to go to the command module and attempt to open it and rescue the astronauts. But the only issue with this is that the command module's door does not open outwards, it only opens inwards. The problem with this is because of how oxygen-rich the atmosphere was inside, when it got ignited, there's a bunch of pressure that built up, meaning you have no physical way possible to push that door in because there's so much pressure pushing back out. And no, you might be wondering if this was a mistake to build that door to open inwards, but the reason for that was actually for safety, ironically enough. They thought that as long as the door opens inwards, there's no chance of somebody accidentally opening it up during spaceflight. It does make sense on paper, but this is one of the main factors as to why the astronauts were not able to get out, and even if they had got out, they probably still would have been scorched. Now, after the fact, investigators determined that the temperature inside of the module had exceeded 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The astronauts, of course, were trapped, they had flames all around them, and not to mention, there were toxic gases in the atmosphere from everything burning up. There's just literally zero chance for survival in a situation like this. Their last moments on this Earth were spent in complete agony, and if this description doesn't help you realize the gravity of this situation, this is what their suits looked like. Completely charred, no chance for survival. Easily though, the worst part about this entire tragedy is the fact that this was completely preventable. Engineers for a long time leading up to this project had brought up issues about the flammable oxygen-rich atmosphere, as well as the wiring, and I don't understand why people didn't listen to them. The main reason though that's often credited for why this project didn't pay attention to its safety as much is because we were really trying to outpace the Soviet Union, and this was pretty personal during the Cold War. The deaths of Gus Grissom, Edward, and Roger had left a lasting impact on NASA as well as the entire nation, and Gus had already survived a near-death experience during the Mercury missions. He had expressed his unease with the Apollo program.
There's always a possibility that you can have a catastrophic failure, of course. This can happen on any flight. It can happen on the last one as well as the first one. So you just plan as best you can to take care of all of these eventualities.
So much so that he once hung a lemon on the command module to symbolize his lack of faith in its safety and design. And for those that don't know, more than likely this is meant to say the module was a lemon, which usually means a faulty piece of equipment that hasn't been built to standard. And prior to this incident, this lemon might not seem like a very big deal, but afterwards, it almost appeared as though Gus had predicted the future. In the aftermath of the tragedy, NASA was forced to confront the failures that led to the demise of these 3 astronauts. The Apollo program was halted for approximately 20 months while the spacecraft underwent some major redesigns, but really no redesign could erase the memory of the 3 people who lost their lives, all for the sake of progress and beating out the Soviet Union. Now, at the end of the day, a lot of people say that Gus, Edward, and Roger had lost their lives for the sake of progress, which, yes, I suppose that is technically true, but the fact that NASA was cutting corners like this and really failing to maintain the safety of their aircraft is pretty telling that this was more of an ego thing than an issue of progress. To this day, though, there are memorial plaques at the Kennedy Space Center, and this serves as a reminder for people who visit it of the 3 lives that were lost that day, and it serves as a reminder for NASA and any other space agency out there in the world that you shouldn't cut corners. It's not worth human life. Now, as always, let me know what you guys think about this incident in the comments below. Drop a comment letting me know what you want to see next. In my bio, I do have my Patreon as well. You can help support me there. There's also a free version, but I release videos there early as well as exclusive content, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace out.